Hey everybody, my name is Ted Forbes and welcome back again to another episode of The Art of Photography. And today we're continuing on our composition series here, and we're going to discuss two concepts. One is simplification and the other one is negative space. And there's a reason that I'm going to do these together because I think they intertwine quite well. And as usual, what we're going to do is, if you're interested in reading more, we have a blog that we're keeping. So if you go to compositionstudy.com, or you can go to theartofphotography.tv on the main website and find a link from there. But what we're doing is we're just keeping kind of a journal and kind of a log and writing these things out. You can see all the sample images there, and it's a wonderful chance to kind of follow along where we are with the composition. You can also follow along on Pinterest because I'm bookmarking a lot of images there, and my URL in there is just pinterest.com/TedForbes. And so anyway, the subject that we're talking about today, simplification and negative space. Simplification is, I think, it's a very easy concept, but it's one of the hardest things in photography or painting or anything else, particularly photography. And I think it's one of the things that people have to try the hardest to get good at. I know I do. And basically simplification is just reducing your image or the components of your composition down to what is absolutely necessary. So it means taking things out of the picture that are extraneous, that don't have anything to do with the subject or the picture or what it is you're trying to say visually or any of that. So a lot of times, you know, it's really easy to think of this is the same thing as being a minimalist or minimalist photography. And I think it is to some point. That's a real easy, no pun intended, simplification of this. But I think even more so, it doesn't necessarily have to apply to just minimalism. It's just simply removing extraneous details that do not do anything to enhance your picture to give it more clarity. Years ago, when I was in design school and I was getting formal training in that area, I had a teacher who was really good, and she used to talk about this is what she called figure/ground relationships. So you have figure-ground relationships. And just on the very simple visual composition element, you have figures, which is your subject or elements that are in the composition, and you have the ground. And the ground, think of it as just a blank canvas. It, you know, if it's a painting, it's the actual size of the painting. If it's a page in a magazine, it's the page of the magazine. If it's a photo, it's however big your image is and whatever those dimensions are. That is the ground. And the figure is what goes on top of that. And so we used to talk a lot about, and I'm going to start talking about on here, are figure-ground relationships. And this is a very simple thing, but it's really hard to get down and master, particularly I think with photography, because photography, if you're in a studio environment, everything's very controlled, and that's one thing. If you're doing street photography or you're doing landscapes, it's harder to control what's going on in your image. Usually, it's easy to be lazy and just go photograph stuff, and if there's, you know, a light post or something that doesn't fit with the image, whatever, it was there. This requires doing a lot of things. It requires changing your viewpoint, changing your idea of what the composition should be. It requires getting in closer, moving in further back. It requires looking at your image and understanding what it is that you're photographing, understand how these compositional elements are playing together, and going that extra mile in simplification terms to reduce that. And it's easier said than done. We are going to look at some images in a second where I'm going to point out some really good examples of this process. But it's hard to do, and I think it's hard for photographers to do because we're not drawing things into our composition. We don't have to put them in. They're already there. And so removing them is even more difficult. For somebody who draws or paints, this is different because you simply decide not to draw it or, you know, decide not to paint, whatever. And so there's ways of masking that out, which are more difficult, I think, for photographers. So that's the idea of simplification. It's just simply reducing it down in your figure-ground relationship to only the figures that need to be there and how they relate to that ground. Now, we're going to use that to segue into what I want to talk about with negative space. Negative space is simply, it's a weird term because it doesn't mean negative in the sense that it's bad space or it's poor for your composition. It simply means it's empty space that allows the figures in your composition to breathe a little bit. Sometimes you have lots of negative space, sometimes you don't have much at all. And it's really tricky and very difficult to understand how that negative space relates to what's going on with the subject in the composition. So let me put it this way. Like, for instance, if I do a really minimalist composition of a boat on a horizon, the sky, the water, that could be negative space. There's not a lot of activity going on there. There may be a little bit of texture, a little bit of pattern. Maybe it's a solid color if the sky's at night or up through the day, midway. And that's okay. It's allowing the subject, which would be this boat on the horizon, to breathe a bit. And it allows it to speak more loudly. It puts more emphasis on the figure that's sitting on the ground. There's a lot of ways of doing this. Another kind of trick that I like to talk about a lot is if you actually have your figure-ground relationships, the closer to the edges you put figures and allow it to breathe with negative space, the more emphasis you're going to have on them. So if you take a portrait of somebody, and we'll look at some of these in a minute, and their head is off-center and maybe it's towards one of the corners or one of the sides, it starts to create a little bit of energy and a little bit of dynamicism, is that a word, that bring emphasis to that subject. It doesn't work when you have a lot of extraneous stuff in the rest of the image, because that's all grabbing the viewer's attention as well. So you have to have that contrast of the negative space there to allow that subject to breathe. And so, I think the easiest thing to do is think of these in terms of minimalist photography. But we're going to look at some examples in just a second that are both. We'll look at some minimalist examples and some examples that are just really genuinely good uses of negative space. And then I got a couple examples where people are really tricking it out to do interesting things. So anyway, come on over to the computer and we'll have a look, and we'll talk about simplification and negative space. Some of these images you have seen before. I've showed them to you. Michael Kooning is a photographer we've covered, oh gosh, it's been a couple years. One of my favorites. And a minute ago, I know I said that simplification and minimalism aren't necessarily the same thing. However, simplification is an essential ingredient to minimalism. And I think these images show it best, which is why I'm going to start here. This is a beautiful image. It's just very typical of Kooning. It's a square ratioed image of a fence and a snowstorm. And it is beautiful. You're also going to start seeing, as we go through these, that some of the concepts that we've talked about in previous episodes on here are going to start to overlap. And so obviously you're seeing use of line, an implied line that's made up of a bunch of little lines of fence posts. And so if you've already discovered that, you're going to see that a lot of this stuff starts tying itself together. And that's what interesting work is it's an interesting way of communicating concepts that, we, as we're discussing in these episodes, deem to be more interesting in terms of composition, and trying to get your own voice and do new things with that. Kooning does this very well. But anyway, this use of negative space, you can barely see the horizon back here. But the point of this image is the negative space around it defines this fence. It defines a certain proportion. It defines a certain location of where that is in the image. And if this were pulled back or cropped differently, it would have a different feel. But in essence, that's what we have is excellent use of line, excellent use of negative space. It's not negative, it's snow, but it's space that allows that fence to breathe, and that's what defines it. And you're going to see this a lot in Michael Kooning's work. Here's some other images. Another one of my favorites is just a little clump of trees, again in the snow with a cloudy sky. Not a lot of definition, very high contrast image. Most of your definition occurs with this little clump of trees, but again, they're beautiful in a way that is defined by that negative space around them and the subtle shadows that come under them. And this is why negative space simplification is so important. There's nothing in this image that is not important. You could argue that there's some texture in the sky that could come or go, but I would argue that it stays, because it does create a little bit of depth to that negative space, but not so much that it's distracting. So anyway, very interesting. Again, Michael Kooning, a famous image, some boards sticking out of water, and look at where they're placed. They're not dead center. They are vertically, but not, they are dead centered vertically, but not horizontally. They are off to the right, and that is defined by that negative space around it. It's not just arbitrarily thrown onto the ground or onto the canvas, as we say. But it's a very specific placement, a very specific symmetry that comes from the reflection in the water, and that use of negative space is what really defines that. So this is what's important here. So those are some really minimalist images, and maybe one that's not as minimalist is this is a famous Henri Cartier-Bresson image. Taken in France of an orchard of trees that the road runs through, and it's again very beautifully placed. We haven't really gotten back into rule of thirds yet, but it does comply with that. But really what's important is that use of negative space. If there were clouds in the sky, it would have a different feel, and it really, again, simplification. What's important here is the road and the trees. The field supports it to an extent. The sky definitely backs it up because it is well used negative space. So that's another great example. Another one that's really cool, I've covered Arnold Newman on here before, famous for doing environmental portraits, as he called them. And this is a portrait of artist William de Kooning, taken in New York in '59. And de Kooning's work, he was one of the key figures in the New York abstract expressionism movement, and I love the way he's incorporated de Kooning's portrait in with something that signifies the way de Kooning worked with some of the splatter and some of the abstract expressionism that comes into this. And again, this would feel very different if it were not taken through a sheet, if de Kooning's face weren't where it is. Remember I said earlier that figures on your ground, if they're near the edge of the canvas or on the ground, it gives them more emphasis, and this one shows that, is that you can see his face is very near the edge of the ground. It would not work if there were more activity. If he'd not used a piece of plastic or whatever it is that the paint splattered on, you'd have more definition in the window, and it would start to take away from this image. So again, perfect placement with everything, simplification. Only the elements are here that are needed. The splattering is there because in these environmental portraits, Arnold Newman signifies that that is, in fact, what the person does, is he's an ABEX artist, so it is required. So anyway, moving along, I'm going to give you an example. This is another one of my favorite images. This is Joseph Hoffner, and wonderful photographer, Austrian, and this is an image just basically of a small waterfall. But look at how the negative space and several areas just define this subject in the middle, and it's really almost an abstract. You can barely make out, because you've probably seen small waterfalls before, that this is indeed running water. But you have pure black space up here that's negative, pure black space down here that's negative, some negative space in the middle actually that's white, and the way they come together to form this image. This is something that is more difficult to do compositionally. It's something he really thought through, and I think it works to a great extent here. Another example of this, ironically less abstract, is Man Ray's famous negative kiss. And when you first glance at this image, sometimes it looks like maybe a plant with leaves or something botanical, and then you realize that it's two faces that are kissing, and it's actually displayed in negative rather than positive. And again, you are playing with figure-ground relationships. They come together in the middle to form what essentially kind of starts looking like a botanical form or some plant life type thing. Or organically, it's also faces and lips. So very interesting. This would not have the same effect had this been turned into the positive. And I think this was exceptionally interesting use, albeit Dadaist, of what's going on with negative space. So anyway, excellent stuff. Just a couple others that I'll show you real quick. Again, Keith Carter, I think one of the greatest living people today in photography. This is a heron that was shot with some kind of abstract in the background. Is it a moon? Is it a street light? What is it? But anyway, it's defined by largely negative space. Again, simplification. What's interesting is perhaps that blur is arbitrary, and if that were taken out, it would have a different feel. It adds a little bit of symmetry to the eye of the heron, and it's up here in the corner, which does draw attention to it, and I think it adds just a little bit of needed balance to this picture. I think it's in the right place. It would be a little bit different. I don't think it would be unbalanced, but I think it gives it depth, and it's balanced in that sense, which is very interesting. You can go through here. These are all my stuff on Pinterest. Just another couple real quick. This is Arnold Newman again. It's a portrait of Aaron Copland, famous composer, American composer, who has a wonderful profile and such a great nose. But you can see that you have negative space up here around the sheet music defining that, and the sheet music acts as negative space to define the head and that profile more strikingly. Again, working together, this is kind of a double to bring emphasis to the subject at hand. And one last thing I want to show you, and we've talked about this image before. Let me show you the other version of this first, the famous Stravinsky image. We talked about this. This so far has kind of worked in every episode. It contains elements of line. It contains elements of shape. And it's also defined by negative space. What is the negative space here? Well, the background could be considered negative space, but really the piano lid, is actually defining a lot of negative space itself. What's really interesting is here is the original image of this, and I found this online on somebody's blog, and this is the full 4x5 that Stravinsky photographed. He decided later for the print to crop this, to play more on the negative space and to make it even more striking. It works very well as an image without the crop, but it really adds that sense of minimalism and emphasis on the shapes, lines, rule of thirds, all the directions that are going on in this, the diagonals, the negative space use, and what the final result was is, it's cropped, but it's extremely interesting. And again, this is a wonderful photograph, and I think it's really interesting that he chose this cropping on that. So anyway, once again, you can check all this stuff out on Pinterest, pinterest.com/TedForbes. You can kind of check out what we're doing in advance, because I will build these usually before I record the episode, so they're ready when I'm ready to show them. And if you got any questions, email me, hit me up on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever, and, we'll catch you next time. Happy composing, and go ahead and start shooting and start thinking about negative space, start thinking about simplification, and maybe even start thinking about minimalism a little bit. And we'll continue next time. All right, guys, this has been The Art of Photography, and thank you for watching.